Welcome to the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. This is Jeff Strauss. Today, I'll be speaking about why company reorganizations always seem to feel chaotic. Spoiler alert, it's because they are chaotic. This episode of the podcast is aimed at a corporate audience, but if you're not in the corporate space, you might still find this useful if you've ever worked at a job where parts of the company or even your team have been restructured. So, before we kick things off, I want to share a personal anecdote about a particularly large reorg I participated in as a leader at a previous job. Some of what I'll talk about may be familiar to you. I was a manager of a team that had a lot of overlapping skills and processes with a few other teams in other parts of the business. Our bottom line mandates were similar, which were we helped colleagues with their technology needs, regardless of what those technology needs were, but we did so in different lines of the business. Now, after some evaluation of redundant processes and some thinking about how to create efficiencies, our leadership decided to reorganize several organizations into one large organization via an interdepartmental merger. I'll talk a little bit about different types of reorganizations in a few moments, but internal mergers are one of them. This merger was big. Several international teams, each with their own set of customers, many with their own processes, their own relationships, both intra and inter-team, and without much contact with other teams in the merger prior to the merger. So, to the credit of leadership at the time, plans for the merger were transparent, with the rationale for why it was happening made clear, and a quote, North Star, unquote, vision planned for what the ultimate business objective would be. It was a good step to get buy in from the teams and reduce any resistance, a very important concept I'll talk about shortly. While there were certainly grumblings about why a merger was happening, which I understand from the perspective that reorgs are chaotic endeavors and people are understandably concerned and anxious about what a reorg means for them, which I'll also talk about extensively in this episode, the teams generally remained positive and, regardless of any disagreements, committed to the vision. Where things went slightly awry was in planning how individuals and teams were going to function post reorg. There was a lot of confusion about who was going to do what because, as I mentioned, there was some overlapping skill set and process. Planning was generally focused on reporting lines so people knew who their manager would be, but there wasn't a lot of emphasis placed on the existing team's flexibility and adaptability to respond to changes in the environment, which is necessary in a reorg, especially a complex one. What's interesting is that one of the organizational design mottos of the company is context, not control, which is a non-linear organizational design element, exactly what's needed to be adaptable and agile in a complex environment, but it's very hard to do that effectively. And despite the ethos, the focus was on a more linear hierarchical structure. I'll talk more about linearity and nonlinearity in organizational design a little bit later in this episode. I have friends and colleagues that I highly respect still at that company who were involved in the merger with me. So I want to mention that this isn't a critique, it's merely a hindsight observation. I've reflected a lot about how I could have done better at that time, and there's a lot I would change about how I acted then based on what I know now. I left the company for another opportunity toward the tail end of that reorganization. So, full disclosure, I don't know how it ultimately panned out or whether the North Star guided the teams towards success. I hope for all those involved that it did, but for that reason, I won't go so far as to say if the reorg was a success per se, because I don't know if it met the objectives that were originally set for it. But I will say, at the time I left, I experienced something that I've experienced over and over again in my career, both before this particular reorganization and after. The teams and individuals adapted to the change. Adaptation is not synonymous with success. Just because an organization has adapted to a new environment doesn't mean it's gained efficiency or is any better than it was. In fact, it may be less efficient or is worse off in other ways. Our species is still here because we're adaptable. So, one of my focuses in this episode is to talk about reorganizations in a way that eliminates the illusion of adaptability equaling success. So, let's begin by talking about what a reorganization, usually shortened to reorg, actually is. As you may have surmised, a reorg is a process where a company intentionally restructures its internal framework, which can involve shaping its hierarchy, workflows, departmental structures, roles, or business processes. The primary goal of a reorg is to realign the company with its strategic objectives, improve efficiency, or adapt to changes in the internal or external environment. Reorgs can take shape in different ways. There can be structural changes where reporting lines shift, or departments are reshaped or eliminated, or leadership roles are redefined. There can be operational realignments where there are changes to processes, workflows, or technologies that affect day to day operations. Cultural shifts can also be forms of reorganizations. Efforts to transform the organization's values, behaviors, or leadership styles to foster desired leadership or cultural traits can be undertaken. Or there can be financial restructuring where adjustments are made to optimize resources like reallocating budgets or in the most obviously euphemistic of cases, quote, reductions in force, unquote, are made for financial optimization. A reorg is often seen as a radical step to revitalize the company's performance, so it may not be out of line to say that a radical step can feel like chaos. And let's talk about why most of the time it actually is. According to numerous data on reorganizations going back half a century, which unfortunately is to say only back to the 1970s, up to 80% of reorganizations fail to achieve their intended value. So if you know there's a reorg coming your way, you're not really a cynic to think it will be unsuccessful because most of them aren't. Most of them are not successful. More often than not, reorganizations are really re-disorganizations where chaos is a feature, not a bug. And this is because traditional management approaches focus on linear processes. That is to say, traditional management approaches are founded on the notion of cause effect relationships, that a predictable input results in a predictable output. But in reality, those cause effect relationships are the exceptions, not the rule. Companies struggle to adapt as business environments become more complex, especially when they try to apply mechanistic, outdated models that focus on stability, because organizations are non-linear entities. They're complex, dynamic systems where minor perturbations can lead to unpredictable results. And the mismatch between the expectation of stability and the reality creates a sense of chaos among those involved. There is no equilibrium in turbulence. Now, poor communication can add to that sense of inherent chaos, something to which I can personally attest because I've been a victim of poor communication during a reorg, and I'm ashamed to admit I have been the cause of it. Lack of transparency and poor communication are causes of what I think is the most common symptom of chaos in a reorg: uncertainty. Employees and even managers are often left in the dark about the future, causing not only uncertainty, but anxiety levels to spike. The combination of uncertainty, anxiety, and decreased productivity is the perfect recipe for resistance, a death knell for any initiative, but much higher impact for a reorg because resistance during a reorganization tends to be subtle and manifest as passive resistance or engaging in ineffective behaviors to stall the reorganization efforts. It's dastardly. The lack of clear communication by leaders often undoes any efficiencies attempted by the reorg because it can lead to confusion and inefficiency as employees struggle to adapt to new and often ill defined structures, processes, priorities, or goals. The vacuum that the absence of clear and transparent communication leaves is easily and quickly filled by misinformation and rumors. If you want to see efficiency, observe how fecund worst case scenarios are in a vacuum of accurate information. Misinformation erodes trust in leadership and undermines the goals of the reorganization. Organization Organizational environments are turbulent by nature, and poor communication exacerbates the instability. When employees can't rely on clear information, they'll interpret events based on their internal biases or incomplete understanding of the broader changes. The stress caused by uncertainty can be worse than the stress caused by layoffs because employees are exasperatingly disempowered and overwhelmed, caught in cycles of constant change with no clear end. Going back to the concept of stability, part of this chaos is usually management's attempt to return to a fictitious equilibrium, which leaves organizations ill prepared for abrupt environmental shifts, further stressing employees. Poor communication compounds the chaos by failing to establish new patterns of collaboration and interaction. And without a clear flow of information, it's difficult for teams to realign themselves within the new structure. I'm going to talk about agility and alignment in a little bit. So now, as we see, poor communication is one of the most common reasons that reorganizations fail without a clearly articulated vision. Employees can't help but wonder how their work fits into the bigger picture, and this can manifest in inefficiencies when employees focus on tasks that are no longer relevant. This particular pattern is very, very common. So let's discuss the leadership challenges of a reorganization a little more. The role of leadership in driving chaotic reorganizations is well documented. Aside from the fact that leaders have to be extraordinarily well aligned in objectives, communications, and process, which is hard enough, during a reorg, leadership must be able to handle nonlinear dynamic environments, which is difficult enough as an individual, to say nothing of a team of people. Let's forget the organizational design elements for a moment. We'll get back to them. And let's talk about a couple common destructive leadership themes I've seen in reorgs in my career. First, the self serving reorganization. This unfortunately happens rather frequently and is often driven by leaders who are more focused on personal gain rather than organizational improvement. A self serving reorg tends to reflect a leader's desire to leave their mark. Sometimes they leave their stain, enhance their reputation, or consolidate their power. When there's a new leader in an organization, either by way of internal promotion, but usually by external hire, they can be intoxicated by the prospect of change, and they frequently initiate a redisorganization that results in perpetual cycles of chaos that benefits their own career but leaves disarray in their wake. Sometimes these leaders push for reorgs to demonstrate decisive action or align the organizational structure to their personal preference rather than do what's best for the company or the people underneath them. These types of reorgs damage morale, disrupt operations, and often fail to deliver long term value. Another common type of reorganization is one based on some arbitrary time interval. This happens a lot. When reorgs are driven by arbitrary timeframes rather than concrete needs, they risk becoming self serving or purely symbolic exercises, and they cause operational instability, decreased morale, and serious inefficiencies. Why do leaders push for arbitrary reorgs based on an imaginary time based necessity? Often it's because they suffer from or want to create the illusion of action or progress, even when there is no strategic alignment behind the change. It can also be because they're under the false belief that a reorganization can fix performance problems caused by issues that can't be solved by a reorg. Arbitrary time-based reorgs often ignore the complexities of and the nonlinear nature of the modern business environment and tend to create more misalignment than alignment, making the company ultimately less adaptable and agile and more prone to failure. That's the exact opposite combination of what's needed to succeed through turbulence. Okay, so I think I've done a thorough job scaring you about planning or going through a reorg. Many of you may resonate with some of what I've talked about, and you're experiencing PTSD because a reorg can quite literally be traumatic. And perhaps there's a reorg coming in your company and you're anxious. So, what follows is, I hope, some comfort if you're an employee. If you're a leader, the following is a research based approach to designing a reorganization to be successful and with the right kind of impact and stressors. Remember that not all stress is bad, but for stress to be productive and motivating, it must be applied the right way. So, how can we design more efficient and successful reorganizations? I've spoken about the concept of linear thinking, or that there's a direct cause effect relationship in business. But as much as we'd like it to be so, it's not the case. So, the first thing that would suit organizations well in any endeavor, not just reorgs, is to adopt nonlinear thinking. Companies and their employees must abandon the notion that stability and predictability are achievable. Instead, they should embrace complexity and view chaos as an opportunity for adaptation, which will require flexibility and a mindset shift away from seeking equilibrium and toward fostering continuous evolution. Employee education on complexity and nonlinear dynamics is crucial to that end. Learning and development teams can design instruction focused on systems thinking and complexity science that highlight how small changes can lead to significant unpredictable impacts and how to navigate and exploit those scenarios. In linear thinking, feedback is often ignored or delayed. I've discussed feedback loops in numerous training videos available on my website, but communication channels should be established across teams and hierarchies so that feedback flows both ways, and team autonomy must be introduced so individuals have the freedom to make decisions and adjust processes based on real-time data. These both align with the agile concept of self-organization and feedback loops, and is absolutely critical to remaining agile and performant during a reorg. Experimentation and iterative learning is also crucial. Linear thinking promotes rigid planning and execution, but complex systems require experimentation and adaptive learning. So, part of the autonomy provided to individuals and teams should also be the freedom and support to experiment, fail, and learn. An environment where employees feel safe to take risks is crucial to the success of a reorg, because teams that see failure as a stepping stone to success are able to channel chaotic energy into productive outcomes. There are many more aspects to nonlinear thinking that I'd like to cover, but the last concept I'll talk about on this particular thread is that of context, not control. Leaders in nonlinear organizations act as facilitators and context providers, not controllers. Instead of top down mandates, they should focus on enabling teams to respond to emerging challenges and opportunities. Ultimately, leadership's role is to guide, provide resources, and remove obstacles rather than dictate every action. Seemingly contrary to the idea of nonlinear thinking is that reorgs should have a structured plan, but with flexibility. Autonomy is essential, as I mentioned, but teams also need structured frameworks to guide their actions during chaos. Complexity must be embraced, but structured planning is still essential, although it shouldn't be rigid. It must allow for adaptation as unexpected challenges arise. Self organization can help with this because top down control isn't imposed, and instead, environments are created where teams can spontaneously organize and adapt, which allows organizations to respond dynamically to external changes. Now, a shared vision is crucial for dynamic organization and adaptation because it acts as an anchoring mechanism during reorgs, so teams remain aligned despite external chaos. And this alignment is crucial when organizational structures are shifting because it ensures that all team efforts contribute to the broader organizational vision despite uncertainty. OKRs are a great way to create clear and shared goals across all levels of an org. But whatever goal setting framework is your preference, it should empower teams to make decisions independently, but still remain tethered to a clear and coherent strategy so they stay productive even in disordered environments. If you're not familiar with the OKR methodology, go look it up. It stands for Objectives and Key Results, and it's my favorite goal setting framework. Let's narrow the focus very briefly to the team management perspective. Team leaders should develop the team's ability to adjust how they communicate and exchange ideas based on the task at hand. Now, in the literature, this skill is called discursive modulation. It focuses on how the range of different ideas or meanings expressed within the team changes based on the team's immediate needs. When a team is working on ideation tasks, for example, like brainstorming or creative problem solving, they should have high discursive diversity, meaning team members share a wide range of different ideas or perspectives to foster innovation and creativity. On the other hand, when a team is focused on coordination tasks, like executing plans or organizing efforts, they need low discursive diversity because in this mode, everyone should be more aligned in their thinking and focused on consistency and clear roles to avoid confusion and reduce friction in their operations. Successful teams can modulate their communication styles, adapting to different scenarios, which can help them remain highly performant during turbulent times. And finally, and believe it or not, this is probably the most difficult part of it all. Leaders must not only be aligned and fully committed to the reorg process, but they must model behavior that supports positive change and engage with employees at all levels. A unified, approachable, trustworthy leadership team is essential to minimizing chaos. Leaders must foster a culture where team members can openly communicate their challenges and adjust strategies without fear of blame. Leaders must embrace and espouse a culture where the focus is on what is right, not who is right, the result of which helps teams stay resilient during periods of turbulence. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. If you found this useful, please do subscribe to the channel and share this podcast on your social media platforms. It really is a huge support.